Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. In recent times, the world has witnessed a record decline in poverty. Yet at the same time, various reports indicate that the disparity between incomes has increased tremendously, as has the concentration of global wealth in a few hands. What is interesting is that both these outcomes are directly related to the capitalist system. Now, the debate regarding the capitalism is age-old, but with all the technological progress, the shifts in political trends, and the economic growth stagnation, we keep going back to whether capitalism has done more good than bad. Today, we discuss this with our esteemed guests. We welcome to the show Jonathan Portes, who is a professor of economics and public policy at King's College London. And also joining us today is Dr. Hafeez Pasha. Dr. Hafeez, I'd like to begin with you. So as I mentioned here, capitalism has been attributed to elevating people out of poverty. Can you tell us more about whether or not capitalism has benefited the common man?
The point that needs to be made is that is the trickle-down effect reaching out to the poor people strong enough when you have a situation where with capitalism, particularly in some of the developing countries, you see fairly high growth, but not so much alleviation of poverty. And if I may take the liberty of giving you the example of China, China has consistently achieved more than 7% growth, although they refer to themselves as the communist China. Really, the system in operation there is very capitalist today. They have been successful. The trickle-down effect was very strong, and almost poverty has been close to being eliminated. In China, it's down to a single-digit level of about 6 to 7%. That's one story of phenomenal success. The other story where you have seen relatively high growth rates, particularly after the 90s, is India. Yeah. India, again, has had a kind of a capitalist orientation, particularly in the last decade or so. But unfortunately, the trickle-down effect has not been very strong, and we are told that poverty has not been reduced as much as it could have been in India. Pakistan is an interesting story. It's a story of a country which, at least over the last 2.5 decades or so, has had modest growth rates of somewhere between 4.5% to 5%. But interestingly, the international data on poverty indicates that Pakistan is one of the more successful countries in terms of poverty reduction. And today, our poverty, according to the World Bank estimates, are down to a single-digit level. I don't believe that, frankly, but I think we are still being fairly successful in reducing poverty. So the issue is the kind of growth that you see in capitalism, whether there is a strong enough trickle-down growth, and whether it eventually filters down and reaches down to the poor segments of society.
So capitalism only benefits depending on the trickle-down effect. Over here, you also mentioned India and China, and one of the things that is noticeable there as well is the swelling of the middle class. Could you please tell us about that?
India is a country which has apparently been more successful in the expansion of the middle class. And that is because India's exports have increasingly acquired a more technological character. For example, the exports of India of IT services is very large and growing. And that has led to an increase in demand for professional and technical talent. And that has created a kind of a burgeoning middle class in India. But the kind of growth India has had, particularly the lack of higher growth in agriculture, has therefore had an effect on not leading to much reduction in poverty. Pakistan is an interesting case. We saw middle-class emergence in the era of Musharraf's government. Yeah. Why did we see that? We saw that because during the Musharraf era, much of the growth was concentrated in what one might call the modern or the formal sectors of the economy, particularly sectors like large-scale manufacturing, banking and insurance, telecommunications, and services. And these are again sectors where the demand for employment of relatively educated people is greater. And as a result of which, unemployment rates for graduates and postgraduates declined sharply. And that is what led to the emergence of the middle class in Pakistan up to 2008. Thereafter, there has been some contraction in our middle class because growth has shifted away from the so-called formal to the more informal sector of the economy, where you tend to have more semi-skilled and less skilled employment.
Thank you so much for that historical perspective, Dr. Hafeez. And something interesting that you mentioned here was in regards to China earlier, that even though it claims to be a communist state, many of its policies are very much in line with capitalism. And I'll take my next question to Mr. Jonathan here. So in the conference in Davos, a Chinese official also stated that while addressing the claims of the stagnation of growth in China, that China has been able to avoid a financial crisis because there can be more government intervention there. So in regards to that, what can you tell us? Do you think that China's system serves as an ideal example?
China has been extremely successful in generating growth, and as Dr. Pasha correctly said, in generating growth which has substantially eliminated poverty in China, which of course prior to 1979 was indeed a very poor country. So China has been very successful. Whether that makes China a model for the rest of the world or other countries that are seeking to escape the poverty trap isn't in itself clear, because there are very special characteristics of China. But it's certainly true to say that China has hardly been, what we've seen in China is hardly pure free market capitalism by any means.
Yeah.
There has been and still remains very heavy state intervention. And I think that goes back to a lot of what Dr. Pasha was saying, that it's not so much, are you capitalist or not? The question of whether capitalism is good or bad is really, frankly, a meaningless question. It's almost impossible to find a country in the world that isn't either a failed state, like, say, Venezuela, or completely isolated, like North Korea, that isn't in some sense capitalist. Sweden is capitalist. China is capitalist. The United States is capitalist. Singapore is capitalist. All of these countries have very different models, very different economic models, and very different approaches to capitalism. And they all have, in quite different ways, very substantial degrees of government intervention in the economy. The idea that capitalism means that there's no role for government, that government doesn't at every level intervene to shape the institutions to determine how capitalism actually operates, is a mistake. So I think talking about is capitalism good or bad isn't a terribly interesting question. The question is for each individual country, like, for example, Pakistan, what sort of capitalism do you want? What can government usefully do to shape the evolution of the economy under capitalism? What can Pakistan learn from China? What can it learn from Singapore? What can it learn from the United States?
And Dr. Jonathan, here in a globalized economy, does it still, that factor of what the capitalist system in each state should be, is that still relevant and as important?
Absolutely. Although globalization, of course, means that we are progressively more interconnected, that doesn't mean that every country faces the same problems or has the same economic model. And domestic politics and domestic conditions remain extremely important to how economies develop. What's right for China is not going to be right for Pakistan. That doesn't mean that Pakistan can't learn something from China, but it does not mean that you can simply import or replace, import a model or copy what another country does. It doesn't work like that.
And thank you for that comment, Mr. Jonathan. Right now, I'd like to introduce another guest who has joined us, Zafar Iqbal Kalanauri, who is a corporate lawyer. Thank you so much for joining us. So while we're talking about capitalism and the economy, one thing that obviously comes up is the corporate culture. Could you tell us about how that has evolved in the recent decade?
You see, as far as this question, basic question is concerned, whether capitalism is good or bad, there is no cavil with the proposition that if you look at the world economies, capitalism came as a replacement to other systems like communism and socialism.
Yeah.
And though few corporations and companies are firing all the shots. They are controlling the economy. Overall, it is good for the people, but where it went wrong is that when wealth is accumulated in the hands of few to the detriment of the others. For example, if you buy out your competitor and end of the day, you end up that certain beverage companies are owned by one corporation, then there is no healthy competition. Here you go wrong. And there is another concept of mixed economy going on in some parts of the world very successfully, where state must have some say or control in some of the things, like health sector, like education, like labor problems, and like there has to be a control over prices. You have to determine those prices. And recently you see, by way of judicial activism in Pakistan, what Chief Justice of Pakistan did. I have worked very closely with him as his right-hand man. And we have been going to people, and what we have done basically is the Chief Justice has not transgressed his powers or intervened into anything. He has said, whatever you have to do, you have to do. If you don't do it right, so somebody has to give you a supervisory role and control things. And that starts, paying. For example, by virtue of the 18th Amendment in Pakistan, certain subjects became provincial subjects, like health and education. And here you cannot control the prices, you cannot control the services charges.
Mr. Kalanauri, that's a point that I do want to discuss in detail. But before that, I'd also like to introduce another guest who has joined us, Professor Steve Keen, who is a crowdfunded economist at Patreon. Steve Keen is also an Australian economic historian and author. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Keen, when we're talking about capitalism here, of course, the evolution of it is necessary, and we've been talking about it in the corporate sense. We've been talking about how realistically, it's not a binary term. But before that, I'd like to move behind a little and talk about how it evolved into being the primary choice for most economies when they want to go towards economic growth.
Well, I think it goes back to the Industrial Revolution, in fact, which began, of course, in the late 1700s in the UK. And the major factor there was that this sort of technology could have developed a long time earlier, but there was no necessary profitability for a feudal system to build something which would, replace human labour. Whereas at the time the Scots invented the steam engine, there was a large market system which had been taking over from capitalism from feudalism for about half a millennia. And in that system, with high wages in Scotland, it was actually profitable for entrepreneurs to invent systems which replaced human labour, or even replaced, replaced animal labour. So capitalism made that possible. High wages made it desirable to do that in Scotland, whereas low wages in France meant that it was cheaper to continue using peasants for similar work. So it's not a straightforward thing, but it's certainly capitalism inspires more innovation than previous social systems have done. And particularly so when capitalists find they're paying wages they regard as too high. In that circumstance, they'll be forced to innovate.
And you mentioned here how it provides more innovation, but also something that it does happen is greater alienation when there is greater commodification of man. Can you tell us about that and how throughout time and now, especially in the modern age, that has changed?
Probably one of the main things causing things like the Gilets jaunes protests in France. You can commodify everything except two most vital things to capitalism. That's workers and money. Neither of them are commodities in the genuine sense of the word. And if you treat a worker like a commodity, then you basically pay the worker the means of subsistence, the capacity to remain alive, but not do anything more than that. Now, whenever that happens, you start getting working class revolts. And this is something Marx was very clear on. And interestingly enough, he used to argue that what he called the value of labour power, which is just that subsistence, is not the average wage, it's the minimum wage. Every time he spoke about it, he said minimum wage. So if you drive workers down to that level, you turn them into commodities, they will then revolt, particularly if they're on the borderline and have been in France and pushed below it, then you get political revolt. So you've got to pay workers more than their means of subsistence, otherwise you have social conflict. And we've certainly seen that erupting around the West.
And next question to Jonathan. So Steve Pearlston wrote a book, Can American Capitalism Survive?, in which he showed that 80% of Americans agreed with the statement that a free market economy is the best statement a decade ago, but that has decreased considerably to 60%, and now 42% of millennials think that capitalism is the best system. What do you think is causing a shift of mentality here?
Well, I think Steve has it partly right in that what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years, particularly in countries like the US or UK, is that an increasing degree of insecurity and precariousness among some sections of the labor force, combined with really disproportionate gains of wealth to the top end. And that is obviously associated with technological developments, in particular the growth of tech companies. What we've seen with companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and so on, is this sort of increasing degree to which the rewards of innovation are captured not by workers in general, the population in general, but by a very relatively small number of people at the very top who own these companies, and to some extent those people who have the skills to work in them at the highest level. And I think that is the main problem that capitalism faces going forward. We worked out how to deal after the Industrial Revolution. We worked out how to deal with capitalism, how to integrate a welfare state which provided a reasonable distribution of the rewards of capitalism to the population at large in a way which secured political, economic, and social peace. We haven't worked out how to do that with post-industrial capitalism or capitalism based on technology. And that really, to my mind, is a big challenge for the next 10, 20, 30 years. How do we ensure that fair distribution in a way which so far we haven't really grappled with? Thank you. And
Mr. Jonathan, I want to, on that similar point, take my next question to Mr. Kalanauri here. So how does corporate culture, and I want a legal perspective here, we're hearing the perspective of an economist, of a historian, but how does the corporate structure protect the worker, and how does it protect the owner differently?
In our part of the world, we are a developing country. We have to save our entrepreneur. We have to save our person who creates wealth, the wealth creator. And ease of doing business is something which is very, very attractive all around the globe. In countries like ours, if some investor comes in, there are a number of problems. And one of those problems is that our legal system is a long drawn battle. It does not make life easy for someone. He invests, and you go to a court of law, obtain an injunctive order, and
Mr. Kalanauri here, you are talking about Pakistan and the environment here, but when we're talking about accessibility to legal rights all globally in terms of workers, how has that changed, and how has misinformation changed? How has ignorance changed, if it has? Have workers become more aware of their labor rights?
You are absolutely right. As far as awareness is concerned, that is there. But once you get aware of something, you have to enforce it through some mechanism, either through the court or out of the court. So around the globe, people are now settling their disputes outside the courtroom with the help of these alternate dispute resolution mechanisms like mediation and arbitrations. They provide a forum where you get it quick. But if you go to a court of law, which is adversarial kind of practice in Pakistan, here it's a long drawn battle. So awareness of rights is one thing, but to enforce those rights, you need a legal system which also delivers, and maybe outside the court. And that is not there.
That system is not there. And what do you think needs to be done to improve it?
First thing, we ought to have some legislation in place. The legislators in countries like ours, they are fighting with each other. They are not enacting new laws. They are not legislating. That point of view, that you see, they have to take into account that the old system is not going to deliver. So this is the problem. For example, if you look at new company law in Pakistan, where you have to form a company, this new law is a good one. People are not aware that it provides so many resolution mechanisms at the SCCP level. So you are not aware of that. You go to a court of law and it is a long drawn battle that way also. So if new laws are not there, if some new good laws are there, awareness is not there, people are not using them. And this is the reason that people don't come out and they go to an ordinary court of law. And that goes on. And this is kind of disincentive to professionals also. For example, I am one of the professors of law at one of the leading educational institutions in the country. 25 lakh people who are professionally well trained. They are coming out and graduating every year, but there are no jobs for them. So there is a brain drain. They are going out of the country, and eventually they are not contributing to the economy of our country again.
And with that, I want to take my question to Professor Steve here. Professor, so what do you think, in your opinion, are the main principles of the capitalist system which have perhaps hindered or impeded democratic growth, that have harmed the progress of humanity?
That's a big question. Certainly, the impact of the financial sector is something which is left out of conventional economic thinking, because they treat the financial sector as just an intermediary, which is completely false. And when you then have financial concentration going on, what actually happens in the terms of distribution of income is that the workers lose out and the bankers gain. The capitalists tend to sit in the middle. So you have as you let the financial sector get rampant and offer the levels of household debt, corporate debt that exists in the West, you have a breakdown in social cohesion, because in fact it's the workers who pay without a lower wages. I think a lot of damage is also done by mainstream economic theory, because what's happened in the West in the last 40 years is the complete dismantling of the union movement, which gave workers the capacity to bargain collectively and spread the cost of them bargaining to begin with, and they'll also match the bargaining power of the very concentrated employers they were bargaining against. This was all done in the belief that it'd make the market more efficient. It completely ignored the concentration on the employer side, focusing just on the employment side. And even conventional economic theory, called the theory of the second best, tells you that will make welfare worse. So I think economic theory has actually contributed to the extremities of capitalism. We'd have a less damaging capitalism if we had a more realistic economic theory.
And on that point, stay with us, Professor Steve. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to continue this discussion. Welcome back to Indus Special while we continue our discussion. And Professor Steve, before we were going to break, we were talking about this and about the politics of it. And something that I'm interested in asking you is, how is politics in the capitalist system affected by the capitalist system, in the sense that when revenue and when funding is done by those who own the means of it, are policies drawn to protect the owners, and will policies eventually come and force those at the lower end of the spectrum to suffer?
Well, I think certainly the capitalism is a system where power plays a major role in setting incomes, and that's again ignored by conventional economic theory. And in fact, I've just marked a brilliant PhD thesis by a man called Blair Fix in Canada, where he said, in trying to interpret the distribution of income that he found in empirical data in America, the only way to interpret it was to say that your pay reflected the hierarchy of which you were part. So the more people you command in a hierarchy, the higher your pay level. And that made sense not just of the capitalist period, but right back to the feudal period and even right back to Sumerian civilization. So the hierarchical side of how we distribute income is not something which is unique to capitalism. It's a general tendency. And I think we've let it get to be damaging in the West, not so much by the actual hierarchy structure itself, but again, we're letting the financial sector get out of control. And that has dramatically shifted the distribution of income from workers, who are the vast majority of the population, of course, to bankers, who are a minority and actually should be a much smaller minority than they in fact are. So I think that's the main damage we face now. The financial crisis has exacerbated that inequality.
And Professor, here, one thing that often comes up is the disparity factor. Of course, there is a noticeable disparity, but how does that in fact impact human condition? How does that impact a worker's ability?
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter if the disparity is such that the basic level of income is sufficient to survive. People will tolerate that. If particularly they lack power to organise politically, they'll tolerate it. If you push them below the point where they simply can't make that survival decision anymore, and I think that's what was really the real trigger for the Gilets jaunes protests in France, with the increases in oil in the cost of petrol that the working class were facing, courtesy of Macron's so-called climate change tax. You push them below that level, then they will revolt. So what we have to do is make sure there's a floor below which people don't get driven, and that floor has to be sufficient to survive. Now, politically, of course, capitalism can cope with that sort of thing, but economic theory argues free markets are best. Let's not put any interventions in there, including anything about survivability. I think a society that makes that mistake is doomed. And so we have to say that we have to provide a minimum standard. And then if you're successful as an entrepreneur, you can get above that, fine, that's great. But don't mean that people who are below that level are going to starve to death or be homeless.
And we are talking about protests here, and something that I want to get your opinion on is the right to protest and how that has changed, because the whole theory behind capitalist system and the rationale of how it commodifies the workers is that it becomes a cog in the system and they might not even have time to think about what is happening to them. How do you think in recent times that has changed?
Well, again, what's happening in Paris is France in general is a very good demonstration of what's gone wrong there. Again, to restrain worker power and the false belief that workers and unions set wages wrongly by charging more for workers than they deserved. That's conventional microeconomic theory. We've demolished their capacity to organise and also seriously constrained their capacity to do things like strikes. So in the past, a union could declare a strike, what used to be called a wildcat strike, and there was no way the employers could stop it. What's happened in the West is the employers and the government as well have drafted laws which mean that workers have to have a secret balance to hold over the strike in the first place. All sorts of limitations of that nature. I personally understand why there can be corruption inside union circles, as I've experienced myself. But those constraints have gone so far that there really is no power on the side of the workers for bargaining in that sense. Also, of course, these days with just-in-time manufacturing, systems of that nature, 3D printing, it's very possible to break the power of a strike, and the strike is actually counterproductive as something for the bargaining position.
Professor, something that you're talking about is revolt, and I do want to ask Mr. Kalanauri here, what do you think that corporations do to attempt to pacify their workers if they do see that there might be dissent or there might be an aggressive attitude coming from them?
One way of doing is that they offer shares in that particular corporation to the workers also, so they become the stakeholders. So they see that if a company grows, they are going to get a better share. And now agitation has also changed. Instead of going for a complete lockup, people go slow policy, they adapt, Instead of producing, let's say, 8 units in 1 hour, the workers start producing 7 units and then 6 units. And, eventually people come to terms, and this is how you negotiate. Overall, the capitalism has increased the living standards of ordinary workers, the laborers, and the professionals also. You see, all around the world, they have better housing facilities now. They have better education for their children. And, living standards have increased also. This is all because of the fact that they are getting their share of the kitty as well. And then there are minimum wages also fixed. You get those minimum wages also.
But have the pay gaps also increased here?
Yeah, it has increased, up to some levels. Like if there is a very competent professional and on merits he's inducted or she's inducted, and they can produce much more and perform much better, naturally they will get better salaries. But at the end of the day, corporations are growing that way also, and this is new employment opportunity for the young professionals.
But cost cutting often comes down to the workers, not to the profits. So how does that get reconciled in the corporate culture when you do see that workers are demanding more?
There are extreme examples. If you look at America, I think it is the most livable country in the whole world even today, because if you work hard, you get everything you are looking for. Though there is a gap between the rich and the poor, but the poor are given so much salary they can survive. And then you look at Scandinavian countries. This is another example, which is a mix of capitalism and socialism, and they have also a good balance. You have better per capita income. Those people are also happy. But then there are extreme circumstances where rich is getting richer and poor is getting poorer. And you have to look at those economies as well. World being a global village now, you cannot ignore one part of the world and make a progress on the other.
Yeah.
For example, in China, the state has, made so much money, they have progressed. But if you look at ordinary person, I'm sorry to say, their life is not that good as it is in America or in Europe.
And a point that is coming to my mind here is regarding the capitalist structure and whether or not in corporations that allows corruption.
They do allow corruption up to some extent also, because you see, when you go into politics, they have their own men installed in politics. Sometimes they say you are doing lobbying, and sometimes they go and they hit the other people, like if there is a car manufacturer mafia. So they will dictate the prices that way that they gain, and they are hand in glove with the politicians also. Here I say this corruption has been institutionalized that way also.
But do the laws in turn, when we're talking about lobbying and supporting the politicians, do the laws that are developed and the policies that you've seen, the trends, do you think they are geared towards more of the protection of the owners as opposed to the workers?
Absolutely right. They are more tilted towards the people. There always has been a gap between haves and have-nots. That is still there. So we will have to look at these laws also, and these gaps need to be addressed, because, after all, the people who have money, who can dictate, they have the political power as well.
How do we address those?
This is by creating awareness, having the right people in the, legislative assemblies who represent those classes. For example, there are countries like Pakistan, which are basically agro-based countries, and there are hardly any representative from the agriculture sector in the assemblies or Senate, though 70% of the population lives there. And if you look at those industries where, raw material comes from the agriculture sector, they are also at a disadvantage then.
And in this case, how much of transparency is needed in the corporate culture in order to make sure that the worker is in fact know their rights by law, and they also, in terms of termination and many other things, do you think that there is a need for greater transparency?
Absolutely right. There is this is much needed area. We have to work on that. People are not aware of their rights in the one place. And secondly, we have to look at the accountability process also, which is a very weakened kind of thing. People go scot-free, they are into this corruption, end of the day, they are not taken to task. Maybe they go behind bars, but they don't return what they have gained illegally. So this is an area we really need to work on.
Professor Keen, something here that Mr. Kalanauri pointed towards was the American dream, and I'm curious to know what your opinion about that is in this capitalist market.
I think it's better called the American delusion. When you look at the level of social mobility in America, it's actually lower than it is in Europe, where they think there's all these state constraints that stop you having mobility. I think a similar stats would apply in Japan as well.
Yeah.
So this delusion leads Americans to believe they live in the best country on the planet, when if they get any moderately serious illness, they'll go bankrupt unless they're a millionaire. So it's a delusion, and it comes down to the different national characteristics of different capitalisms. It isn't true that there's simply just a market system and that's it. If you look at Germany, for example, they have, ever since the Second World War, possibly before, they've had a system requiring union members to be members of the board, what they call the Aufsichtsrat board, a parallel board to the company board. And that does give the workers a stake, a hold in the company. It means also you can't completely ignore their positions, as American manufacturers tend to do. So you need to consider a legal framework that enhances the best of capitalism and constrains the worst. I think, unfortunately, we've done the exact opposite, certainly in America.
And Professor Keen, something here that you mentioned Japan here, and something that comes to my mind is the case of work deaths in Japan. And I want to know what happens when culture and capitalism intersect. And do you think that it's adopted, the capitalist structure, even if it's globalized, it is adopted differently by culture, and how that varies?
Oh, of course. I mean, again, culture affects how people relate to their social system. And when you start from if we go back to 1868, Japan was still a 100% feudal country. So when it made its adaptation to a capitalist economy, it was after Commodore Perry turned up with American warships made of metal, which were a total surprise to the Japanese, and they then went to adopt a form of capitalism which still combined that feudal structure. So you have large numbers of Japanese corporations are organised in what they call keiretsu, which are industrial conglomerates where there will be a bank which actually provides a lot of the money that's used for the investment by the firms. Now that's why Japan can carry a higher level of private debt than America can, as well as running a trade surplus. So these sorts of things, a country will always adapt it to its own culture, and I'm sure that's happening in Pakistan.
Yeah, and on the other hand of it, do you think that capitalism is eroding culture? Do you think that this rise in extreme nationalism is in fact a reaction to that eroding of culture?
I think it is. I think it's not actually just the fault of capitalism in general. Again, it's the theory of economics that said this would be a good thing, both talking in favour of free trade when the logic of the free trade case is hollow, and ignoring the income distribution issues as well when they're a fundamental part of that same case. So I don't think it's just capitalism per se. But the other thing we can't ignore is that, as one of my best friends once said, as a capitalist, his ambition was to privatise his profits and socialise his losses. Now, that's okay when you're not affecting the overall climate of the planet. When it starts to affect the climate of the planet, that is going to put massive constraints on what can be done by capitalism. It'll still be capitalism, but it won't be anything like the one we talk about today.
Yes. And something that comes up when we talk about capitalism is the threats to it, and technology often comes up. Can you tell us about that?
That's a major issue because one of the reasons workers can bargain for decent wages, which are far in excess of their actual physical contribution to production, is because the machines couldn't be operated unless the workers pressed the buttons. Now, if the machines themselves are effectively pressing the buttons, then physical productivity doesn't rely on labour anywhere near as much as it used to. 3D printing makes that even more extreme. So we're heading to an area where there's a very small need for the number of workers to produce the level of output, and you simply cannot expect their wages to fall to compensate and make them cheap compared to machines. Like, there's no way workers can throw a satellite into space, for example. So as technology moves in that direction, workers' powers and workers' bargaining rights fall, and I think the only way to give income to the mass of the population is to have a universal basic income.
Yeah, and so do you think that in the future we're going to see those economies that were geared towards or more leaning towards capitalist structures start adopting more socialist values?
There's the danger is you don't want to get caught in the lack of innovation problems that beset the Soviet system. Janos Kornai wrote a brilliant analysis of that where he talked about what he said were resource-constrained versus demand-constrained economies. And you want one where firms are feeling constrained by the lack of demand for the capacity they've got, and they therefore innovate. Now, if you go in a completely socialist central planning system, you get down to one car, one Ford, one electricity supplier, and so on, and you may lose that innovative spark. So it's not an easy question to say it's not capitalism versus socialism.
Yeah.
Again, you've got to think very intelligently about the pressures that you want to put on people to innovate,
but
and also you want to limit.
Can we expect a more hybrid system to emerge? Of course,
yeah,
we cannot
we
cannot put a binary here between the two, but we can expect that in the future that economies will try to find a middle ground between them.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we, again, getting away from neoclassical economic ideology is a very important factor there. You have Friedman at one stage, capitalism and freedom arguments that only capitalism gives you freedom. Hayek's argument as well, they're false. And we have to say it's not a binary thing. There is a question of building a capitalism that is also compatible with the planet.
Yeah. And on that point, we were talking about how technology progress is changing things. And I want to ask you, with greater technology here, Mr. Kalanauri, of course, there has been a shift from manual labor to labor that is more focused on intellect and mental capabilities. How have labor laws evolved or changed in order to meet that, in order to protect those workers that are exerting themselves mentally as opposed to physically?
We cannot oppose the advent of this technology. This is part of the world now. I take it at a larger spectrum. There are certain things which public sectors should be taking care of. There are certain things private sector should be taking care of. And you know, governments are there and public sector is there to look after the rights of the weak segments of the society. And these poor laborers are weak segments of the society. We have to come to their rescue, like providing them free medical aid, providing education for their children. You know, these are the kind of rights they cannot afford within their salaries that they get. And this is another way of compensating them. And as far as, you know, these machines are concerned, these are there to stay now. What we'll have to do is we have to improve the standards of human beings also. They need to be refined. They need to be technocrats now. How to operate these machines? For example, you have great machines in these hospitals, but you don't have a technical staff to look after that. And after all, these machines are also operated by technical staff and the laborers. If they are given this kind of enhancement in their working capabilities and they are educated and trained, they will get much more as they are doing right now.
And over here we're talking about fringe benefits and how those are increasing, but of course they cost more to the employers. So how are corporate laws at this point in time regulating the interaction between the owners and the workers? What mechanism is in place there?
You know, in some parts of the world they are doing very well, because you know, the people who own these corporations, they are contributing towards the welfare of the laborers. And instead of laborers contributing towards that, they come to the rescue, and this is how a balance is created. You know, if they're left on their own and God forbid they are taken up by a serious illness, they will not have to afford, they cannot afford it. And this is a big issue in countries like America also, the medical cover. They have much better in England or Canada that way. And so you can always have some kind of balance where people who are more affluent, they contribute, and this is how distribution of wealth takes place, and then everybody's happy.
Yeah. And on that point of distribution of wealth, I want to ask Professor Keen here that, of course, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And you talked about the French protests here. And something that I want to ask you is that we are seeing a greater concentration of wealth. An Oxfam report came out that stated that 26 of the billionaires of the world own as much as the wealth of the poorest half, 3.8 billion people. How in the future do you see dissent amongst the people increasing because of this concentration of wealth?
Well, I think that's what Nick Hanoa was talking about, the pitchfork factor, that people, if the inequality continues rising, then the pitchforks are coming, to quote a billionaire on that front. So we can't let it continue. The main reason is that, as I've said, this is caused by increase in private debt, which benefits the wealthy. The poor suffer in terms of their pay level. And that's what's actually made this dangerous, because it isn't just a case of, you know, inequality is bad. It's also this sort of rising inequality leads to a financial crisis and an economic breakdown. So unless we do something about it, then I think this is an unsustainable trend for capitalism.
And you're saying that unless we do something about it, what do you think is the way out? What policies need to be adopted?
I've been in favour for a long time of what I call a modern debt jubilee, where we use the government's capacity to create money, as central bank can create money just as private banks can, but it doesn't come attached with debt as private money does. You could use that money-creating capacity to inject money on a per capita basis to everybody in the economy. Those who have debt can just use it to offset their debt. Those that don't have debt could be required to buy shares with that money. You could democratise the share ownership and reduce inequality that way. What's been done instead, of course, with what's called quantitative easing, is driving up the price of shares, which benefits those who own them, but doesn't benefit those who don't. So actually, our remedy to the financial crisis in the West has made the inequality even worse.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Steve Keen. We're out of time, so I wanted to thank all the guests who joined us for today's discussion. Zafar, Iqbal, Kalanauri, thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll hope to see you again tomorrow.